Pulling double duty today, Varus. I'm working a double here. So when you lead singing, you tend to sing louder than usual, and so when you go to preach after leading singing, your voice just doesn't want to operate as it should. So we're gonna have to train Jaden to be a full-time song leader. Although, if you've heard Jaden lead singing on Wednesday nights and Sunday nights sometimes, man, he does a really good job. So maybe he's already ready. He just doesn't even know it yet. He is in band class, and so anytime you take music classes like that, it equips you for that type of thing. So, oh well. What is the name of the church? That's a question that a lot of people have. What is the name of the church? The reason why people have this question is because Jesus said that he would give the church a name. In the book of Revelation, if you recall, in chapter 2, he promised this to one of the churches there. I can't scroll. He said in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 17, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I'll give him some of the hidden manna, and I'll give him a white stone, and a new name written on the stone, which no one knows but he who receives it." So when we talk about the name of the church, it is not something that people can see, but it is something that's between us and God. He says no one can know but he who receives it. It's not something that we put on a sign, but it's something that we show forth in our lives. This is name of the church. In Revelation chapter 19, Jesus is pictured riding on a white horse. And he had a name, as you see in verse 12. He has a name written on him, which no one knows except himself. Verse 13, he is clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. The Logos, the Word of God. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John chapter 1 and verse 1. And the only people that can know that are people that are in Christ. The only people who really get that, who understand the foolishness of the cross, are those who are willing to make themselves foolish so that they can receive that wisdom, as you learn in 1 Corinthians 1 and 2. So when we talk about the name of the church, we're not talking about what most people think we're talking about. When you talk about the name of the church, most people think you mean Baptist church, Methodist church, Catholic church, Presbyterian church, Episcopalian church, or even Church of Christ. But so when we look at Romans chapter 16, and we read what he says there in Romans 16 and verse 16, "Greet one another with a holy kiss. All the churches of Christ greet you," or "all the churches of Christ salute you." We are not reading a name that is given to the church, but we're reading a description of the people who are greeting those at Rome. It is the called out ones, the ecclesia, the called out ones, the gathering, the assembly of Christ. In like manner, he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, "To the church of God, which is at Corinth." Now see, he wasn't writing to the church of God and not to the Baptist church or not to the Church of Christ. This wasn't a denomination that had this name up on their front building, or the building, Church of God, right across the front, right? It wasn't the churches of Christ at Rome and the Church of God at Corinth. But this is a description of who these people are. They are the called out ones that belong to God, just as they are at the same time the called out ones that belong to Christ. Just as at the same time they're the firstborn, they're those that belong to the firstborn of God. This is not a name, but a description. The church that belongs to God, the church that belongs to Christ. In what we call the Restoration movement in the 1800s, which was really an extension of the Reformation movement, you have three distinct groups that pop up during that time. But these three distinct groups, they were united in purpose and in mission, and even in many times teaching. There were little differences here and there, but they were a united front. The names of these three groups, as we would call them names, but really their descriptions, were the disciples of Christ. So that's not a name, it's a description. The Christian church, that's more of a name than the others, but still it's a description. It's called out ones made up of a group of Christians. And then you have the Church of Christ. Again, the assembly that belongs to Christ. It's not a name, but a description. Okay? So when we see the difference between name and description, then we see how this whole discussion of what is the proper name becomes a little bit more silly, because there is no name like that, like what we think. They didn't have church signs in the first century. In fact, do you know what they did in the first century? They had to go hide in their back rooms when they worshiped in fear of persecution and getting killed. They didn't put a name out there on the front. So out there on the front of the sign, when it says Hickory Street Church of Christ, there's a large group of people in the world that look at that as a name and not a description. They don't see the difference. In fact, there's many people who are members of the Church of Christ. That when I say that, I mean they worship at places that have Church of Christ on the front. They look at that as well as a name and not description. Even though the name Church of God is used in the Bible, right there, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 2, they wouldn't set foot in a place called the Church of God, because the expression Church of God has become for many people, again, a name and not a description. You see, you are all members of the Church of God. You are all members of the Church of the Firstborn. We have a Church of the Firstborn right here in town, right? You are all members of the Church of Christ. But none of those descriptions are a name. They're simply descriptions, describing who you are. Look at, there was a Church of Moses in the Bible. In Acts chapter 7, the writer Stephen there is giving a speech about the history of Israel. And he says that they brought them out, and verse 36, the man led them out, performing wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness for 40 years. Verse 38, this is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness. Do you know what the word there is? The same word for church. The church in the wilderness. This is those that were baptized into Moses like we're baptized into Christ. This is a church in the wilderness, the congregation in the wilderness. It's the same word in the Greek there. It just means assembly. It just means gathering. Church isn't an official title. Church isn't even a religious term primarily. Originally, church just meant congregation or assembly or gathering. Whenever those individuals were persecuting Paul in the book of Acts, it said that the church came together. Well, it wasn't the church like we think of it. It was just an assembly of people. And so when we look at this expression, church of Christ, what we're really saying is this: assembly of people that belong to Christ. That's exactly right. Now, this means that when those individuals back there in the Restoration Movement, when they put Christian church on their building, they were still united with those. See, they were members of the Church of Christ, okay, even though they didn't have that on their building. Do you see what I mean? They were all part of the same group. They didn't see those as names. They saw them as descriptions. When Alexander Campbell would go to preach at a Church of Christ over here and then go over here to preach to the disciples of Christ, those were still two churches of Christ. You get it? Because those are just descriptions up there on the building. They're not names. That's not a distinct group. It's one group. Okay? What has happened, though, is we have turned this description, Church of Christ, into a name like that. You see the difference there? Yeah. Church of Christ, capital C, right? Right. This is our name. This is who we are. People. We shouldn't look at it like this, but this is how a lot of people look at it. Right. I'm a member of the Church of Christ. You're also a member of the Church of God. No, I'm not. Right? Yes, you are. 1 Corinthians 1:2. But see, the way that we use it is denominational. It's causing divisions. It's bringing out distinctions that don't need to be there. And here's the thing, though, my friends. Nobody in this community looks at that lowercase Church of Christ. Everybody only sees the capital C Church of Christ. So when they look at us, and when you're at Walmart and somebody says, oh, where do you go to church? And you say the Church of Christ, what do they do? Have you ever seen what they do? What does their face go like? Do they go, right? You know, why? Because they're looking at it as a capital C and not a lowercase c. Now, here's the question. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, let's go back there. Paul says that when it comes to things, when things aren't a matter of salvation, then you should behave in such a way to help out that person's weakness so they don't fall away in their weakness, right? Let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 4. Therefore, concerning the eating of things sacrificed to idols, we know that there is no such thing as an idol in the world, and that there is no God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, for us yet there is but one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and we exist for him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we exist through him. However, not all men have this knowledge. In other words, there was some there at the Church of God in Corinth, or you could say at the Church of Christ in Corinth, at the congregation of individuals, of believers belonging to Christ, that weren't sold on the idea of monotheism just quite yet. They were raised in a society with idols. They still couldn't partake in the things sacrificed to idols because they were worried that might associate them with some false god, and they didn't want to do that. He says, but some, being accustomed to the idol until now, eat food as if it were sacrificed to an idol, and their conscience weak is defiled. Now here's how Paul wants the church at Corinth to act. He doesn't want the people who know this, that it's okay to eat that stuff, that idols don't really exist, that there aren't really other gods out there. He does not want them to get a big pile of idol food and just eat it right in front of them and say, see, look what I can do, right? See, because that would offend their conscience. They're not there yet. They're not ready for that just yet. So he says, food will not condemn us to God. He said, it's okay for us to eat this stuff. We are neither the worse if we do eat it, nor the better if we do eat it. It doesn't matter. You can eat it. Idols aren't real. But take care of this liberty of yours, and do not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if someone sees you, who have knowledge, dining in an idol's temple, will not his conscience, if he is weak, be strengthened to eat things sacrificed to idols? For through your knowledge he who is weak is ruined, the brother for whose sake Christ died. And so by sinning against the brethren and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore he says, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again so that I will not cause my brother to stumble. When I went to my friend's house this weekend, I told you he eats vegan food as a choice. Do you think I said, okay, I'm going to go get a hamburger, and I'm going to bring it up here and eat my McDonald's while you eat the rabbit food, right? Why would I do that? That's something that he's chosen to do. He's inviting me into his home. He's being hospitable. I'm going to eat what he offers me, right? I'm not going to disrespect him in his household by doing that because that's not where he is. Right. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, now when we went out and got our own food, I'll put some chicken on my Subway sandwich. That's okay. And so did his son, by the way. His son isn't strict. His son eats chicken and fish, but he doesn't eat other meats because of the health effects it has on their family. But whatever. All right, here's the point, though. Paul says, whenever you have liberty, you don't use that liberty to offend other people. Okay, you know the truth. You got more knowledge than they do, so you have to step down to their level and meet them where they're at until they're ready to move to the next step. Okay? Now let's go back to this and see how this applies. All of us here understand that Church of Christ is not a name, it's a description. Right. They call out people, the group assembly that belongs to Christ. Right. But how many people in our community know that? Don't they know? Do you think that they know that it's a description, or do they look at it as a name? Do they look at it as a group of people trying to be undenominational, trying to not be a denomination, not wanting to have a name like that because of what it can lead to? Or do they look at it as just another denomination, right? They say, what denomination do you go to? So, and then when you say you don't go to denomination, they get confused by that because they don't understand it. Right. They don't understand that we're not trying to be on a team. We're just trying to belong to God, okay? That being said, if using this description, though it is completely right, and though it is completely justified and biblical and a very good description to use, if that description is inhibiting our ability to reach people with the gospel of Christ, what should we do with it? If it is perfectly okay to eat food sacrificed to idols, but we have a brother that's offended by that, what should we not do? We shouldn't eat sacrifice to idols. If we are trying to communicate the gospel of Christ to people in the community, but they can't hear the good news of the gospel. People come here, Jimmy said, other people have said, when I came to this congregation, I never knew the Bible could be taught like this. How many people are being blocked off from having that same experience because they don't get that it's a description and not a name? Do you see? Now, here's the question. If we get offended by that, we need to ask ourselves the question, are we being denominational in the way that we think about the church that belongs to Christ? Are we saying it's the church that belongs to us? You see? There's plenty of descriptions in the Bible that are perfectly good to use. And the one that we use is perfectly good as well. But if that inhibits us from reaching the lost, then our pride is getting in the way of the work of the gospel.
That's right. That's right.
This isn't about being right. This is about being like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 8 and being humble and trying to reach people that are lost. Trying to reach people that need the good news.
All right.
When I talk to people in the community, and Laura's told me this as well, teachers at school, says, where do you teach? Where do you go to church? Oh, my husband's a minister. He teaches at the Hickory Street Church of Christ. They don't know anything about us, but that name alone makes them go, because they look at it as a name and not a description. Regardless of whether that's right, it's okay to eat idols. It's okay to eat things sacrificed to idols. But he says if it's going to offend your brother, don't do it. If it keeps you from serving the community, don't do it. And that's something that we need to consider. Jimmy prayed a very good prayer a while ago, and it stirred me to give that. We're going to talk about Leviticus 25, but I thought that was way more important.
Right.
Because you can, here's something, you can be the best guy in the world, but if you say, hello, my name is Saddam Hussein, people are going to go, okay, wait a minute. What was your family thinking? And I'm not saying that about the name Church of Christ, because that's a good and just name. But people's perception of it, regardless of whether or not that perception is true or not, it does matter. It does matter. I was looking at that bookstore I told you about the other day. And I was reading through, and one of these books was written by a dude named Adolf. Now, his last name wasn't Hitler, but when you read that name Adolf, you go, I don't know if I want to read that book, right? I'm judging the guy based on something that doesn't even matter.
Right.
And so if it doesn't matter, okay, if there really are other biblical names out there, then what's the big deal?
Right.
Okay. All right. That's all right. That's where I'm at. Oh boy. All right. Let's go to Leviticus 25. I just had to get that off my chest because that's something I've been thinking about that Jimmy's been praying about, and I think it can really make a difference. You know, my friend Dallas Burdett, he lives in South Alabama in Montgomery, which is more central Alabama, and he went to a congregation, and they had 8 people. And he was driving 200 miles one way every Sunday to go minister to that church. And he goes in there and he says, what's the deal? He says, well, everybody's split. There's 4 different congregations in town. Nobody goes here anymore. The building's paid off, so we just come here and worship with all 8 of us. And we just like you to speak for us. He says, so you're telling me that there's no other group in town that thinks you're a faithful Church of Christ? And he said, that's right. He says, then why are you so stuck with this? Why can't you just... They said, well, we got to keep it. This is a biblical name. He said, a lot of biblical names. And so they called themselves the church on whatever hill, whatever hill they lived on right there. And he said their attendance skyrocketed because people actually was willing to listen to them at that point. Okay, so just, there you go. All right, Leviticus 25, verse 8. Leviticus 25, verse 8. Let's get to the year of Jubilee. All right. Leviticus 25, 1 through 7, we have a set of 7. This is 7 years. On the 7th year, they're supposed to abstain from touching the ground. They're supposed to let that food grow. And on that 7th year, anybody, no matter their social class, no matter their nationality, no matter male or female, slave, free, whatever, they can partake of the land equally, which is a very dangerous message to the landowners, right? Because it lets them know that's not your land, that's God's land. And so that obviously teaches us something about today. When people are using God's land to oppress and hurt others, causing the rich to get richer and poor to get poorer, we should think about who we support in that. All right, but here we go, verse 8. You are also to count off 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years, namely 49 years. Okay, he does the math for them just in case they didn't get it. You shall then sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement. You shall sound a horn all through your land. You shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. You shall have the 50th year as a jubilee. You shall not sow, nor reap its aftergrowth, nor gather in from its untrimmed vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat its crops out of the field. And here's what's going to happen in this year of jubilee. All their debts forgiven. If they sold themselves into bondage to pay off something, they're released. If they got so poor, money was so tight that they sold their land to somebody to get some money to support their family, their land is given back to them on the 50th year. Because at the end of this, he says, that's not your land, that's my land. I'm letting you live there. So he says in verse 13, on this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his own property. If you make a sale, moreover, to your friend or buy from your friend's hand, you shall not wrong one another. Corresponding to the number of years after Jubilee, you shall buy from your friend. He is to sell to you according to the number of years of crops. In proportion to the extent of the years, you shall increase its price, and in proportion to the fewness of the years, you shall diminish its price, for it is a number of crops he is selling to. You shall not wrong one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. Let's keep reading on here. You shall thus observe my statutes and keep my judgments, so as to carry them out, that you may live securely on the land. Then the land will yield its produce, so that you can eat your fill and live securely on it. But if you say, what are we going to eat on the 7th year, if we do not sow or gather in our crops? Then I will so order my blessing for you in the 6th year, that it will bring forth the crop for 3 years. When you are sowing in the 8th year, you can still eat old things from the crop, eating the old until the 9th year when the crop comes in. This whole passage is about God is going to fully supply their every need, and so consumerism isn't that big of a deal for them. It's not about buy, got to get, because God's going to provide everything for them. It's less dependence on man and more dependence upon God. It's going back for just a year. It's going back to how life was in the garden, where they weren't agriculturalists or nomadic farmers or herders, but they were simply those who trusted in the land, producing things that God producing things in the land for them to eat. Now here's something else that happens on this in verse 23. The land, moreover, shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine, and you are but aliens and sojourners with me. Now how about that? Calling a child of Israel alien and a sojourner, that's a naughty word, right? He says that'd be like God saying, you Americans, you think about all these illegal aliens in your country. You're illegal aliens because you don't even own this world. I own it. So how does that show that we ought to treat people? All right, verse 24. Thus, for every piece of your property, you are to provide for the redemption of the land. If a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor that he has to sell part of his property, then his nearest kinsman is to come and buy back what his relative has sold. Or in case a man has no kinsman, but so recovers his means to find sufficient for his redemption. Then he shall calculate the year since its sale and refund the balance to the man whom he sold it and return to his property. This is this is almost like pawning in a sense, there is it not? Pawning off the land of somebody. But these laws are put into place because God knows that not everybody has equal means. Not everybody has all the money in the world and things like that, and so he puts these things within the law to give them a way to get out of debt, to give them a way to be free from their expenses, to give them a way to live and to thrive, and so that they don't have to worry so much about the money, they can worry more about God. In our country, we've flip-flopped it. It's less worrying about God and more worrying about the money, and yet 1 Timothy 6 tells us that the love of money is the root of all evil. All right, verse 28. But if he has not found sufficient means to get it back for himself, Then what he has sold shall remain in the hands of its purchaser until the year of Jubilee. But at the Jubilee it shall revert, that he may return to his property. So he says, now you're supposed to buy this land back if you can. But if you can't, there's a process in place for you to receive your land back to yourself at the year of Jubilee. Now that's shocking to us because of how we view property and how we view ownership. But from their perspective, they were not individuals trying to get ahead of each other, but there were a whole community of people trying to be in communion with God. Now, to be honest, this system was only practiced for a very short time after they got to the Promised Land. They went from all the way to the year 1090 all the way down to 606 without practicing these things, such as the land Sabbath and the year of Jubilee. So this wasn't consistent. But why was it not? Because in 1 Samuel 8, what happens? We don't want God as our king. We want man as our king. They departed from dependence upon God, and they went back from dependence on ourselves, and so they couldn't see the needs of their neighbor anymore because it was all self-driven. Verse 29. Likewise, if a man sells a dwelling house in a walled city, then his redemption right remains valid until a full year from its sale. His right of redemption lasts a full year. But if it is not brought back for him within the space of a full year, then the house that is in the walled city passes permanently to its purchaser throughout his generations. It does not revert in the Jubilee. We have walled cities versus living out in the country. See, the walled cities, they have other means of work. You go and you work down as a carpenter like Jesus did. You go and you work in some other office. Out in the country, though, this law was there because your whole life was how much you produced on your farm. And so to lose that, you don't have any other occupation. And so they put these things in place in order to get back the land that they sold. And that's what he says in verse 31. The houses of the villages, however, which have no surrounding wall, shall be considered as open fields. They have redemption rights and revert in the Jubilee. Then the cities of the Levites have permanent right of redemption for the houses of the cities which are in their possession, and so on and so forth. All right. Let's go down to verse 35 now and see what happens with a poor countryman. Now, in the case of a countryman of yours becomes poor, and his means with regard to you falter, then you are to sustain him like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Now, here, baked into the law in Leviticus 25 is this. Those of you who have means are to help those of you who do not. They might fall into difficult circumstances. They might not be able to afford the things that you can afford, but it is the responsibility of those who are wealthier to help build up those who are poorer. Now, again, this system worked during this time because they were not individuals trying to get ahead of one another, competing with one another, but were a group of people, a community, working together to accomplish a common purpose, and that was to serve God and love Him with all their heart. This is what happens in Acts chapter 3, right? Acts chapter 3, you've got all these souls that have just been baptized on the day of Pentecost, and they have nowhere to go and nothing to do. What does the church do? They bring their possessions together, they distribute them so that those who are wealthy can support those who are poor. Those who've now been displaced from their homes now have something to live off of. This is something that's consistent from the Old Testament all the way to the New Testament. Here's what he says in verse 36. Do not take a usurious interest from him, but revere your God, that your countrymen may live with you. We have a system like this. If you don't have any money and payday's coming up, what do? You go down to one of those stores on the shady corners of the Arcadia, and they give you they cut you a check for the weekend, but you pay so much interest on it. What's the point of even getting it, right? He says you're to help them, but you're not to take advantage of them. This isn't an opportunity to make some money for yourself. This is something you do out of the goodness of your heart. When they can pay back, do you know what they do? They're able to pay it back, but you help them out while they're in need. This isn't a give only, but it's also a give and receive system. It's like a pass it on type of thing. It's positioning them for success, not supporting them, infinitely. It's positioning them for success. Okay, verse 38. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. In other words, I gave this to you freely, so you should be willing to give to others freely. If a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to you that he sells himself to you, you shall not subject him to a slave's service. He shall be with you as a hired man, as if he were a sojourner. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. He then shall go out from you, he and his sons with him, and shall go back to his family, that he may return to the property of his forefathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out from the land of Egypt. They are not to be sold in a slave sale. These individuals who sell themselves to landowners in order to make a living for themselves, they're not to be treated poorly. They're to be treated like hired servants. And at the year of Jubilee, their debts are to be released and they're allowed to return home. Okay. Verse 47. Now if the means of a stranger or sojourner with you become sufficient, and a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to him as to sell himself to a stranger who is sojourning with you, or to the descendants of a stranger's family, then he shall have the redemption right after he's been sold. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle's son may redeem him, or one of his blood relatives from his family may redeem him, or if he prospers, he may redeem himself. So in other words, again, you have this system put into place where people could get out of debt, where people could make a living for themselves, even in the most severe and dire of circumstances. Unfortunately, in our country and in others like ours, we assist people without giving them the tools they need to assist themselves. It's only a give system and not a pass it on system. We as a country need to position people to be able to have success and be able to move up in the social class and be able to get jobs and educate them to be able to make a name for themselves. Here's something for you. We understand the importance of being pro-life, right? In other words, we see the evils of abortion, right? But if we're going to be pro-life, we have to be pro-life even after birth. We have to give these women who we want to have babies the means to be able to survive and provide for those babies. Oftentimes, these babies are being born into lower class families, and yes, they make mistakes sometimes, but we all do, and they don't have the means to support the baby after it's born. And so if we're going to wish women to have babies as they should, we should give them the means and the ability to support those children after they're born, to support themselves after they're born, to care for the mother and the baby. Being pro-life is not a 9-month commitment, but should be a lifelong commitment, as it is here in Leviticus 25. So when we think about Leviticus 25 and the year of Jubilee, think just how far ahead of the world this is. I mean, even where we are today, can you imagine people living like this today? It's possible, but unfortunately, because of greed and the love of money, it might not happen. But the point is that Leviticus is not just some ancient book that's not relevant to us today, but it contains timeless principles that we can learn from and reap from for years and years and years and years, and is far ahead of anything that we've got going on for us now in many cases. All right. Well, I gave you 2 lessons in one, so, that was a little interesting.